We turn now to jobs and the economy and Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo. She joins us from Providence, Rhode Island. Good morning and happy Mother's Day.
Good morning and happy Mother's Day to all the mothers and grandmothers out there.
I want to start with the jobs report. There were all kinds of expectations. There would be 1 million jobs in April. The number came in at 266,000. What do you think happened?
I think we have a long way to go to recover from the pandemic. There are so many Americans still struggling, 8 million fewer jobs than there were pre-pandemic. So, you know, we are working very hard. In fact, we had a meeting with the president on Friday, and that was his direction to us, which is we are making bold moves, but there's a long way to go, and we have to be there to help Americans find jobs.
Did he say do X, Y, or Z to speed this recovery up?
Right now, we're obviously very focused on working with Congress to get the president's jobs package passed and his family's package. The reality is we have fallen behind with our investments in the economy, and people are still struggling, women in particular, still struggling to find affordable child care, to break down some of the barriers necessary to find a job, to have access to the skills they need to get a good job.
Women in particular, between 3 and 4 million lost jobs in this pandemic. It fell on their shoulders because in most families, women bear the burden of the pandemic more than any others. Is there a particular friction to women getting back into the workforce that you've seen that makes this recovery particularly difficult for women?
Yes, absolutely. So first of all, women are clustered in the industries that were hit the most, you know, the lower skill service jobs, waitresses, working in hotels. And we all know that those industries were hit the hardest. So women were put out of work in greater numbers. But the reality is, as you say, you know, women are more likely to be the caretakers. So lack of affordable child care hits women the hardest. The fact that schools were closed and many still remain closed hits women harder.
On unemployment, there are a lot of people who believe that the unemployment relief that people are getting is hurting in the job market. Essentially, people are keeping unemployment instead of going to look for work. Is there any discussion within the administration about tweaking that or doing anything to remove that as a barrier to jobs?
Obviously, we are monitoring that, but at this point, there's nothing in the data which would suggest that that's the reason people are out of work. By the way, we have to remember that when the president moved to make this happen, this unemployment insurance has been a lifeline, a survival, you know, lifeline for so many Americans. The number one reason now that people aren't going back to work is what you said, fear. Or they can't find child care or schools are still closed. So we'll monitor it as necessary, but right now we don't think that's the reason people aren't able to go back to work.
In South Carolina and Montana, they're getting rid of unemployment because they think it has this effect on work. And even in Rhode Island, your successor has pushed for legislation that allows people to keep some of their unemployment benefits if they go back to work. So it does seem that a lot of people out there think this really is an impediment to getting people, that unemployment benefits are an impediment to getting people to go look for work. So it does seem there is some evidence out there.
So there's certainly anecdotal evidence. By the way, this is regional, and it's appropriate that governors in different regions would respond to what's going on in their regional labor market. But if you look nationally, wages aren't going up. People are still telling us the number one reason they're not going back to work is fear due to the virus. And more people were looking for work last month than the month before. So I am engaged with businesses constantly, listening, monitoring, but at the moment, it doesn't seem to be that that's the major impediment.
In conversations with business, one of the reasons the numbers were down this last month is that so-called supply chain manufacturers couldn't get the materials they needed to make what they need. How much of a worry is that to you, and how long might that delay a robust economic recovery?
It's a significant factor. It's a significant worry. You see supply chains having been disrupted across the board. An area that I am particularly focused on as Commerce Secretary is the semiconductor industry. for decades, we've allowed America to fall behind, and we don't produce enough semiconductors in America. And the president's jobs package calls for $50 billion investment so we can reshore that supply chain, make semiconductors in America so we're less vulnerable. And of course, semiconductors they're the building blocks of a future economy. So it's a top priority and something we're working aggressively to address.
But the timeline on that is very long. I mean, the Intel CEO said that he expects the supply chain to the shortage to last for a couple of years. So this is something that looks like it's going to be with us for a while. And also, it seems to me that the president has offered a $50 billion plan on semiconductors over 5 years. But TSMC, the Taiwanese manufacturer of chips, is spending $28 billion a year. So this both seems like a very long-term solution and also maybe not enough.
Well, the $50 billion the president's calling for has to be matched by the private sector. You know, it is my hope that the $50 billion would be matched by another 50 or 100 billion from the private sector. But the point is, we're finally taking action. You know, President Biden's plan, which, by the way, we see a lot of bipartisan support for in Congress. I've had many, many discussions with senators. We have to get going. As you say, this will take years. We're behind, and it's time to take action and get going on the plan now.
As the administration's liaison to business, I wonder what you're hearing about the president's proposed tax increases on corporations. Jamie Dimon, the CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase, said those tax increases were a little crazy. What have you heard from business in your conversations about the future of their taxes being increased?
So in this regard, I have been actually pleasantly surprised. I've talked to nearly 100 CEOs personally, and what they all agree on is they support the president's calls for bold, big infrastructure investments, which are necessary for their competitiveness. They all agree we need investments in broadband, so every American has broadband, major investments in roads and bridges and childcare. The question, of course, is how do you pay for it? And the reality is they knew increased corporate taxes were coming. And I have been very pleased by how many CEOs have come out to support the president's plan. So, listen, there'll be room for compromise for sure, and the president will be meeting with members of Congress this week, hoping to find compromise. But businesses need these investments to be competitive, and that's why there's no time to waste.
I want to ask you about a piece of news on the Colonial Pipeline that was hit with a cyber attack. This supplies roughly 45% of the gas to the East Coast. A, do you think it'll have an economic impact? And then B, is this what businesses now have to worry about? Because this isn't the first business to be hit by a ransomware attack.
This is what businesses now have to worry about, and I will be working very closely with Ali Mayorkas on this. It's a top priority for the administration. Unfortunately, these sorts of attacks are becoming more frequent. They're here to stay, and we have to work in partnership with business to secure networks to defend ourselves against these attacks. As it relates to Colonial, the president was briefed yesterday. It's an all-hands-on-deck effort right now, and we are working closely with the company, state and local officials to make sure that they get back up to normal operations as quickly as possible and there aren't disruptions in supply.
All right, Secretary Gina Raimondo, thank you so much for being with us. We go now to Minneapolis Fed President Neel Kashkari. Thanks so much for joining us. I want to jump right in here to the first question, which is the April jobs report. Help us understand what it means about that specific report and then what you think can be determined, if anything, about the larger state of the economy.
Well, John, I think we shouldn't overreact to any one report, either the really good report that came out the month prior or last week's report as well. But I think the bottom line is we are still somewhere between 8 and 10 million jobs below where we were before the pandemic. Roughly 8 to 10 million Americans ought to be working right now if the COVID crisis had not happened. So we still are in a deep hole, and we still need to do everything we can to put those folks back to work more quickly. Let me just give you one example. When the financial crisis hit in 2008, it took 10 years to rebuild the labor market and put the economy fully back together. That is far too long. And so we at the Federal Reserve are doing everything we can to accelerate that job market recovery because it's good for the economy and it's good for families all across the country.
Well, that specter of a slow, plodding 10-year recovery is what has everybody worried. Speaking of worry, the question of risk, individual risk perception, we do see that people have more money than they seem to be spending. Give us your understanding of personal risk choices that people are making, and can that really be changed, and if so, how?
I think, your discussions with Dr. Gottlieb and the Commerce Secretary were exactly right. It wasn't simply the lockdowns from the government that put a damper on the economy. It was each of us, each of your viewers, each family taking actions to protect themselves. Yesterday, for the first time in over a year, I got back on an airplane because my wife and I have been vaccinated and we felt comfortable. But it's going to take time for that psychology to change. And so I do think that there is some truth to the unemployment benefits maybe being a disincentive. I see that in the data, and I see that in anecdotes as we talk to people. I also think that child care shortages are a big impediment to people coming back in, with schools still being partially closed. And I think that fear, the risk of, hey, I don't want to get back onto a crowded bus if that's what it's going to take to go to my job. Now, the good news is over the next 3 or 4 months, each of those factors should get better as the vaccine continues to penetrate, as the virus continues to slow down, schools reopen, and people regain their confidence. Those things should get better, which should lead to strong growth in the second half of the year and strong labor market recovery, I hope.
It feels like you're telling all of us to look to September when two of those things are happening. School restarts and those federal unemployment benefits will go away. So is that a smart way to think about this? Maybe a little bit sluggish until we get in September. People are more prodded to work because they're no longer getting unemployment benefits. And those who worry about having kids at home, well, the kids will be off at school.
I think those two factors, and I'm assuming continued vaccine penetration, will give all of us more confidence. So, for me, I'm thinking about myself. My wife and I are vaccinated. When are we going to go back into a crowded restaurant where we might be around other people who are unvaccinated? That gives me some pause, even though I know how effective the vaccines are. As the overall population vaccine penetration goes up, I'm going to feel more confident. So I think all three of those factors are all going to trend in a better direction over the next few months. And of course, we have to watch, Dr. Gottlieb and others can advise us on the variants, but the trend is obviously very good, which should boost confidence.
We have 30 seconds before the break. Anything else in the April jobs report that stood out to you?
Well, women continue to be disproportionately affected by the pandemic. I think the data went down for women, actually. There was no job growth. I don't want to overreact to 1 month, but the child care issues continue to be paramount. And that's why getting schools fully reopened, getting kids vaccinated, that's also going to be key to really restoring our economy and getting back to full productivity.
Okay, we're going to take a break really fast right now, but Neel Kashkari, stay with us. We'll talk to you on the other side of the break. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Face the Nation. We continue our conversation with Minneapolis Fed President Neel Kashkari. I want to underscore what you said when we started, which is don't overdo it on looking at 1 month report. However, the projections were that there was going to be 1 million jobs in this 1 month. So that's an enormous miss. What I wonder is there something about this response to the pandemic coming out of it that has kind of thrown off all our abilities to measure economic activity and to project what economic activity will be?
Absolutely. I mean, this is unlike any other economic shock in any of our lifetimes. This is very different than the financial crisis. And as we talked about earlier before the break, a lot of this is being driven by people's own feelings of personal safety, their own health for themselves and their families. It's very hard to model that out and to know. Dr. Gottlieb talked about we've spent a year conditioning all of us to wear masks, to be safe, to be cautious. Now we have to start to change what we've been telling people and get people to change how they feel inside. And so we can put out economic forecasts of how people are going to respond to different incentives, but it's really uncertain. And so it is still the virus and the reality of the virus and people's feeling safe about the virus that's ultimately going to drive this economic recovery. I think the hope is that Congress has been so aggressive in the past year, and the Federal Reserve has been so aggressive in the past year, that we have positioned the economy for a fast recovery, not a 10-year recovery. But there's still a great deal of uncertainty about the virus, but also about how we are all feeling and the confidence that ultimately we need to have to fully restore the economy.
What does a recovery look like, actually? So if it's not 10 years, how many years are we talking about? And is it just replacing the 8 million jobs, or is it replacing the 10 million that we would have if we hadn't been hit by this pandemic?
Oh, for me, it's the 10 million, because our population continues to grow. And so those are new people potentially entering the workforce, hopefully entering the workforce. So you were exactly right. If the pandemic had not hit, we estimate there would be 10 million more Americans working today, both people who already had jobs and new entrants into the labor force. We need to put all of them back to work. And so at the Federal Reserve, we're focused on achieving what we call maximum employment, as many Americans as possible gainfully employed and contributing to our economy. And so for me, I'm looking at, when do we recover those 10 million jobs? I think it's going to take a few years before we can fully get back to that place. But, 2 years is much better than 10 years. If we can do it faster, so much the better.
The Fed thinks about maximum employment and prices. Tell us, in this strange world we're in right now, what we should think about inflation and prices, when we should be nervous, when we should not remember stories from the 1970s and overreact.
Yeah, well, we aim for an average of 2% inflation over time. For 10 years, we've been undershooting that 2% inflation target. Now, we know, just based on math, that in the next few months, the inflation numbers are going to look high, because the way inflation is calculated, it's a rolling 12 months. And so last March, the inflation numbers plummeted, oil prices plummeted. Those data are going to now fall out of the calculation. So just based on math, we know the inflation numbers are going to look high in the next few months. We also know there are short-term supply chain issues that you talked about earlier with semiconductors. So what we're very focused on in the Federal Reserve is looking deep at the data to determine, are these short-term mathematical supply chain issues that should resolve themselves, or are they longer-term inflation issues? And so for me, I'm very skeptical that we're going to have sustained high inflation if we still have 5 or 10 million Americans out of work. We think the labor market is really what's going to drive inflation over the long term. And so we look at a lot of different data. Right now, I'm not concerned about a repeat of the 1970s. I do think inflation is going to pop in the near term, but that is likely going to be transitory. But if we're wrong, and if high inflation comes because of a lot of government spending over the next few years, the Federal Reserve has the tools to make sure that we do not have a repeat of the 1970s. That is certainly not my base case scenario. But if that were to happen, we know how to deal with that.
All right, Neel Kashkari, thank you so much for putting it all into perspective for us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Congressman Adam Kinzinger is one of the few Republican members supporting Cheney and joins us from his district in Illinois. Good morning, Congressman.
Good morning. How are you?
Before we get to the Republican Party, I want to ask you about Colonial Pipeline. You are on the Energy and Commerce Committee. What do you know about this attack, and how important is it?
It's really important in terms of, understanding the role that cyber is playing in the future. Things like critical infrastructure, energy. I don't know much more than what you all know. Maybe I will this week when I get back to D.C., but this needs to redouble our efforts as a country to get past our internal divisions as the end-all be-all of everything and focus on things like critical infrastructure in the future, because this is only going to continue to happen more often if we're not careful.
Speaking of internal divisions, the Republican Party in the House, it looks like Liz Cheney, the number 3 in House leadership on the Republican side, is no longer going to hold that position. What is this debate about?
Yeah, look, it's incredible. So Liz Cheney is saying exactly what Kevin McCarthy said the day of the insurrection. She's just consistently been saying it. And a few weeks later, Kevin McCarthy changed to attacking other people. And so I think what the reality is as a party, we have to have an internal look and a full accounting as to what led to January 6th. I mean, right now it's basically the Titanic. We're like, you know, in the middle of this slow sink. We have a band playing on the deck telling everybody it's fine. And meanwhile, as I've said, you know, Donald Trump's running around trying to find women's clothing and get on the first lifeboat. And I think there's a few of us that are just saying, guys, this is not good, not just for the future of the party, but this is not good for the future of this country. We're 4 months after January 6th, an insurrection, something that was unthinkable in this country. And the message from the people that want to get rid of Liz Cheney is to say, it's just time to focus on the future and move on. Like this was 10 years ago, and we've been obsessed about it since. It's been 4 months, and we have so many people, including our leadership in the party, that has not admitted that this is what it is, which was an insurrection led by the President of the United States, well deserving of a full accounting from Republicans.
But if you are a leader of a party and 70% of the members of your party think the last election was stolen, though they're wrong about that, you're a leader of that party. You can't change the party you're the leader of. So why should a person be a leader of a party that is fundamentally at odds with what Liz Cheney believes?
Because truth matters. Right now, and we have to look and understand why. You know, yes, 70% of the base believes that the election was stolen because they've been told it was. They've been told by the President of the United States. They've been told in many cases by Republican leaders, or at least Republican leaders in the least have not countered it on something so vastly crazy as the election is stolen. You know, and this is why you have this real battle right now in the party. This idea of let's just put our differences aside and be unified. You cannot unify truth with lies. The lie is that the election was stolen. The truth is Joe Biden beat Donald Trump. And I'm sorry that 74 million people voted for Donald Trump. They weren't disenfranchised. They were simply outnumbered. And as a party, let's focus on now, how do we go out and win more people? And that's why actually I started the Country First movement at country1st.com, is just to say, tell people the truth and quit peddling in conspiracies, because that's what we've seen in this party. And they're going to get rid of Liz Cheney because they'd much rather pretend that the conspiracy is either real or not confront it than to actually confront it and maybe have to take the temporary licks to save this party in the long term, this country.
Speaking of outnumbered, though, you and Liz Cheney and maybe Mitt Romney in the Senate are outnumbered by the current Republican Party. It is Donald Trump's Republican Party. The numbers are on their side. So why stay in it?
Well, look, I was a Republican far longer than Donald Trump, and I'm only 43 years old. He became a Republican just a few years ago and tried to change the whole definition of conservatism. So I think it's worth a fight. But, you know, the reality is over time, we're going to see who wins this battle. And then there'll be a lot of decisions to make everywhere as we see parties realign and change. For me, I'm a conservative. I'm going to fight for the soul of this party. And but every member, not just you know, leadership, every congressman, every state representative, every member of the party that pulls a ballot in the primary has to decide, are we going to exist on lies or are we going to exist on truth? And to everybody that grew up in Sunday school like me, that thinks somehow accepting a lie is okay because maybe we can win the bigger battles, I got to tell you, the Christ I follow, the Jesus I know, never says anything about it's okay to lie to the people as long as the end state is the same. Truth matters, and that's what this party has to come to grips with, no matter the cost.
Do you think Donald Trump's power in the Republican Party comes from his ability to grow the electorate, reach out to new voters, or because members are scared of crossing him?
I think it's the latter. I think at the beginning, look, he was able to reach to a sector that we should naturally win, people that are struggling to make ends meet. We also lost a lot of people in that process. But Donald Trump was done after January 6th. When Kevin McCarthy said, you know, this is Donald Trump's fault, make no mistake, he was done. He was sulking away to Mar-a-Lago, didn't even go to the inauguration. And 2 weeks later, when you look at the financial side of it, and you look at the fact there's an election in 2 years and we want the majority, Kevin McCarthy went, and so did Steve Scalise, and they put the paddles on Donald Trump and resurrected him in the party. And everybody after that became scared to death of who Donald Trump was again. And that's what empowered him. And everybody went quiet. That's why the Country First movement I started, country1st.com, is trying to push back, because we have to fight for the soul of this party and country.
All right, Adam Kinzinger, the fight continues. Thank you so much for being with us. and we'll be right back. And we go now to Michael Lewis, author of a new book, The Premonition, A Pandemic Story. He joins us from Berkeley, California. Good morning, Michael.
Morning, John.
I want to start with a quote from Bill Parcells, the NFL football coach. You are what your record says you are. You quote that in the book to explain your view about the American record on the coronavirus. Why is that quote important?
It's important. I mean, the starting point for this book is, look, we were sitting at a little more than 4% of the world's population with 20% of the world's deaths. And before the season, before the pandemic, we were rated by experts as most prepared for this sort of risk. But the games get played, and as Bill Parcells said after a losing season, you know, you can make all kinds of excuses. You can point fingers at whoever you want to point fingers at. All of it is avoiding looking in the mirror, because you are who you are, what your record says you are. And our record's appalling. I mean, what we did is appalling and reflected kind of a deep negligence of our own population. And
you went into this project looking for the roots of that negligence, and you chose a number of different characters to illuminate something. What were you trying to illuminate?
A system, like the system that I was really worried because of work I'd done previously, The Fifth Risk, the book I'd written about the federal government, that the takeaway was from this whole event was, like with a losing sports team, was going to be, let's point the finger at the quarterback or the coach or whoever, and people would think, oh, if we just change a person or two here, it's all going to be better. When in fact, the characters in the story that I tell, you can tell by the shape of their frustration. I mean, they're these extraordinary people who've gone to unbelievable lengths with a kind of obsession to prevent just this thing from happening, that you can tell by how they fail that this is a bigger problem, that we've got these systematic things that we need to address.
And one of the big things you identify as a systematic problem is that the people who know aren't able to get their information into the heads of the people who can act, either because they're not heard or because they're not listened to.
That's part of it. That's part of it. I mean, we had very persuasive evidence. Carter Mesher, one of the main characters in the book, could have sat you down on January the 20th and persuaded you really pretty quickly that what happened was going to happen. And that's a month before the Centers for Disease Control acknowledges that, this isn't a risk to American lives. And in that month, the delay of the response cost thousands and thousands of lives. So part of it is that it's like, yes, the wrong people are being listened to, but part of it is like the system was designed for them never to get there. That we have built, especially at the federal level, a government that operates in a defensive crouch and that punishes risk-taking and punishes error mercilessly, but doesn't punish inaction in the same way. And so anybody who's got wisdom, news, insight that implies action and implies taking some risk is naturally going to be shunned because the government really doesn't want to do that.
And I want to linger on this important point that you're making. What your characters all have is a kind of risk-taking muscle. They've been in this fight for their whole careers. They can see things. They have, title of the book, a premonition, because it's informed. And yet the political instinct in politics, which is to say in an administration, is at odds with that. Is that a fair way to think about this?
It's a totally fair way to think about it. And then you think about, well, what does that mean, right? I mean, what does it mean, especially when you're facing this sort of risk? And a disease risk requires you to get out in front of it in ways that are just kind of unnatural to the structures we have. Because by the time you have proof, by the time you have data that this is a deadly thing that's going to kill hundreds of thousands of Americans, it's too late. The disease is moving among you. You have almost to be clairvoyant, and you have to do things and explain to people why you're doing them, which don't seem obvious. That there's this thing in Wuhan, but actually it's effectively here. And so that it's true. All my characters, the three people at the center of this book, I mean, they're amazing people, but they all have, they'd prefer to commit a sin of commission than a sin of omission. They default to action.
And I want to go back to a point you were making earlier, which is if it's a systemic problem, then blaming Donald Trump, which is what you were hinting at earlier, actually is an impediment to improving systems so that they'll be able to handle another one of these.
Yeah, so I don't want to let Donald Trump off the hook. I mean, that's not really the point. But the point is that no matter how you feel about him, even if you despise him, if your mind comes to rest at, oh, it was all his fault, we are never going to address the underlying problem that actually drove our response. And we are never going to, we're going to be similarly at risk the next time this happens. And I tell you, every single one of the characters in the book make a very persuasive case that this was a dry run, that this could have been much worse, that it could have killed children, it could have been more lethal, and that we're just fools if we think this isn't going to happen again. So to just point a finger, it's like a losing football team. Point a finger at a single person involved and say that's why we lost. That's catastrophic. It's not how you fix the team. Right?
That's right. Michael, we're out of time. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much for being with us. And this program